Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome back to Brussels Forum 2020 in its 15th edition. And this week we've been focusing on a series of critical issues affecting interests on both sides of the Atlantic and transatlantic relations. And today we're really delighted to have a special conversation with two distinguished figures, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager, and Senator Mark Warner from the United States. Welcome to you both and thank you for doing this. These are issues in which GMF has been actively engaged in multiple programs, in fact, principally through our GMF Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative, and also our Alliance for Securing Democracy. And so we're doubly pleased to be able to have this conversation today. Before we start, let me thank our Brussels Forum partners, our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our forum partner, Deloitte, and all our associate and supporting and knowledge partners. We're very grateful to all of you. And we're also extremely pleased to have with us today Cecilia Kang, tech reporter from the New York Times, to moderate our conversation. Again, welcome to all of you. Thank you, Cecilia, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'm so pleased to be here and honored to be here with Vice President Vestager and Senator Mark Warner. I will start. These are obviously very extraordinary times, and here we are on a virtual panel that would normally take place in person. The pandemic and COVID has really affected not only the way things operate like this, but also the economy and the digital sector. I'd like to start off, please, Vice President Vestager, with asking you, are you concerned that out of COVID, there has been some changes within the digital economy and the digital sector that could make the technology giants of Silicon Valley even stronger? That's certainly some conversation that's occurring here in the United States. How are you thinking about competition in the digital sector at this time, and how the technology sector may emerge from this, and any concerns you may have? Thank you.
Here we go. As you see, even though we've all had a crash course in working digitally, I still make rookie mistakes as not unmuting myself. No, these are indeed extraordinary times, and of course, in particular for the many people who are suffering from the virus, people who have lost, people who have not been able to say a proper goodbye. I think it's very important still to recognize that the human side of this crisis is ongoing, and there will be a trauma for a very long time after this. And we have to work with that as well as looking at the crisis and what we have learned. But you're indeed right to say that we learned a lot, because it was a crash course. We have worked remotely, shopped, learned, exercised, socialized, and we could not have managed without technology. That has enabled so many things that would otherwise have not at all been possible. So I think we should really appreciate this. And we have had a positive interplay with a number of the platforms in order to make sure that when people are looking for information, they get information from trusted sources. The first thing they meet is not a conspiracy theory about something, but really trusted information that comes from sources that has a real background and very often also a very scientific background. That being said, I have a sense of urgency when it comes to making sure that the market is still contestable, that smaller businesses, startup businesses, mid-size still have a chance of getting to the customer, because the gatekeeping of the digital giants, that is, of course, one of the things that we see very, very clearly. And you probably also saw a number of cases on the Apple App Store, 3 specific cases and on Apple Pay for contacts here. So, you know, we keep pushing both sort of on
that economy may look as we emerge from this.
Well, Cecilia, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great honor for me to be with you and Vice President Vestager in this conversation. I hope everybody who's viewing this forum is safe and secure during these remarkable times. Agreeing with the Vice President, we've seen, I think, the movement to a digital economy accelerate in certain areas by years. And in telehealth in the United States, we've probably moved a decade down the line on the distribution of healthcare, the ability for, particularly in rural communities, to access healthcare in a completely new way. I think that's net positive. I think we've also pointed out, and I don't think that the problem is quite as great in the EU, but since we have wide swaths of America that still don't have, high-speed broadband connectivity, that is a structural problem that I hope this country will finally address, and I think it is a great challenge. In terms of the platforms themselves, I think I am fearful that this is accelerating the platform's dominance. And I think the failure in the United States to put any regulatory structure in place is both impeding competition, but it's also potentially impeding technology tools. For example, the Apple Google contact tracing platform, which I think has pretty good with encrypted Bluetooth, individual privacy protections, but because we don't have any rules and laws yet, and I've got a legislation on this, that would prohibit secondary use and other restrictions on these major platforms, I'm not sure that the take-up rate amongst states and localities is going to be near as great on a tool that could be useful real time. In terms of the broader potential dominance, I have a great deal of frustration. In my job as a senator, there are things I like, there are things that get me terribly frustrated. The failure of our Congress to act, post 2016, in terms of the Russian election intervention, post all of the abuse that we've seen from some of the platforms on content, post some of the misuse of personal information, the fact that we have still not put any guardrails in place has both enhanced the dominance of the major platforms and also, I think, restricted the ability of new competitors to come into the market.
Indeed, and we are also seeing companies like Facebook, for example, who are announcing acquisitions. Even during this time, Facebook, as we know, has recently announced its acquisition of Giphy for $400 million, more recent. And before that, an acquisition of an Indian company called Jiro for more than $4 billion. At this time, when you think about mergers and acquisitions, Vice President Vestager, do you think that it makes sense to continue with the reviews? Do you think that there may be, that perhaps this is a time to put a stay on these kinds of mergers? What are you thinking about when it comes to the M&A space during this time?
Well, we continue working. It is just as a parenthesis, I think it is amazing what can be achieved. The Commission went from 3,000 to 26,000 remote workplaces in 2 weeks, and the teams now work remotely, but very close together. So we have a number of ongoing merger investigations. We have pre-notifications, so pretty much at full scale. And we think that if it's a business case and there's a business logic to it, that is not for us to question. What we would question would be, what is the state of competition after a merger? Because it is important that the marketplace is still a place where you're being challenged. And of course, we do our best. And for the last now quite many years, we have been investigating also the data side of mergers to see, well, it's important for us to fully understand that side of the marketplace. the role that data is playing, and that, of course, we will continue to do.
Well, and let me go ahead and I think we've got one of those technology glitches going on right now. So let me try to address this. I think the United States, obviously, we have not had a very robust anti-competition policy for some time. We're starting to see individual states take action. We have a Justice Department that is starting to take action, although the Justice Department, I feel, under this current Attorney General, I'm somewhat suspect of on virtually anything they do, whether they are doing it based on what is good law and good precedent or what may be in the benefit of Donald Trump. So that has a little bit of concern to me. I do think this macro question around competition, the difference between our standards and the European basic underlying standards on competition, I think we all know, we still have a system that's based on price. Europeans have a system based on dominance. Price may not be the right metric when we're talking about tools that the platform companies offer, at least nominally, they describe as free. Although I think the Vice President and I might agree that if these companies are giant sucking sounds of collecting our personal data, these services are not necessarily free. Mm-hmm. The approach I've taken, just to give me one more moment here, has not been yet, because I have been fearful. These platforms, we all operate in a global economy, and while I followed the EU's actions, originally I was somewhat concerned that the EU was taking some actions more on kind of attacks against a place where there may be American dominance, not necessarily simply based on competitive postures. But in a global world, I don't want to, I've not moved straight to the antitrust arena and breakup arena yet, because I've been fearful of replacing American giant platforms with Chinese giant platforms that may even have less restraints on them. So the legislative approach I've taken has been more on transparency. My background was the telecommunications and wireless industry before I got in politics. So I've proposed legislation that would say, let's bring about data portability. So if I'm tired of how I'm treated on Facebook, let me easily move all of my data from Facebook to a new platform, but still be interoperable with my friends that remain on Facebook. So a competition move. I'm very much in favor of another piece of legislation I've got that would say we should all have a right to know how much our data is worth. So again, we put more transparency into this transaction that these services are not free. And we still, it's remarkable to me, and this is where I think we've ceded American leadership at a massive scale, that we still don't even have any national framework on privacy. The fact that almost half the world now has GDPR-like standards, and we have a California equivalent, but no national standard, is a dramatic failure of American leadership.
Senator, thank you for that. And thank you for filling in as I was adjusting my own Wi-Fi problems that you actually referenced before that we're having in the US. You touched on a lot of points. In fact, I want to make sure that I get back to a lot of your points, because you covered privacy, competition, and which are all terrific. I want to touch back on.
I didn't know what your question was going to be, so as the Vice President said, we're both pretty good at filler when the needs arise.
You certainly are. In fact, you could run the show. I'm telling you both. But Vice President, let me get back to one thing you said earlier about the focus on data when it comes to competition, and that's something that the European Union has really been more forward leaning on than the US. Can you be specific about how you're thinking about, for example, some mergers that have been proposed, like Google has or mergers underway? Google has announced its purchase of Fitbit. That's been for a while, and I mentioned the ones that Facebook announced recently, particularly Giphy, and you have some investigations underway. Can you just give us a little bit more insight into how you specifically are thinking about data competition and explain why that's so important?
Well, obviously, I will not comment on the Google Fitbit acquisition since it's an open investigation with us. But I do agree very strongly with the senator that this idea that services are for free, that is a complete fiction. It's a complete fiction because you pay with your data, and that data is then being monetized. And even now, with the GDPR having been in effect for 2 years, we see we still have a lot of work to do. We see a beginning market response of services coming to enable citizens to enforce their rights of privacy, because basically you could think about the GDPR as digital citizens' rights. But we still need a push, and I think it's very welcome that we now see a market push. Was just presented with something called ID sites that will enable you to maintain your preferences when it comes to tracking and sharing of data. Because I really appreciate if people want to share their data. My point is just to say, well, they should really know what they're doing so that it's a real choice and not something that these long terms and conditions, I better just, tick the box. So of course, we are happy that we've been able to inspire around the planet, but we still have work to do because rights are good, but enforceable rights is so much better. So that, of course, we'll have to push. But what we're looking for in cases where data is a main asset is, of course, will data act as a barrier to entry? If data sets are combined, is it then more difficult for others to be part of this marketplace? Does data work as an asset when it comes to innovation that makes it difficult or impossible for competitors to innovate in the same area because they do not have access to data sets that will combine in the same way? So we try to get, all around the question of the role that data can play, because it works as a mode of payment that for services that can then be monetized in many different ways. And especially when it comes to barriers to competition, of course, in that we focus especially. We have had a number of different cases, but so far we have had, only sort of data issues as a supplement to much more sort of traditional theories of harm. So in that respect, we're not sort of in a full-fledged sort of data competition economy. Very often we see completely traditional theories of harm, horizontal overlaps, of course, being one of the most obvious.
Thank you. Senator Warner, I'm going to go back to something you touched on, and I think this is a big topic for both of you. This is about China and competition. You outlined some of your concerns about U.S. competitiveness and staying competitive, but also, and your real concerns about the dominance of big tech. How do you balance your desire to contain the power of some of these big U.S. tech companies, while also making sure that the U.S. does not fall behind as China does soar forward in telecom and technology? And I would love to hear a little bit more about how you think about some of the apps that are from China that are very much always at the top of the App Store purchases. They're so popular right now, not just TikTok, but you've heard of Zin, all these new apps that we're hearing about all the time. How are you balancing those interests, Senator?
Well, first of all, let me make one. I've been very frustrated with the tech community that they have been so reluctant about being more forthcoming about how they value data. The fact that they somehow cannot put a price on that is just completely absurd. We have seen internal transactions, we've seen external transactions, and clearly they have models where they say how much your data is worth on a monthly basis, how much the vice president's data is worth, how much my data is worth, and we need that transparency. I think if we're going to regulate, if we're going to have a marketplace, if we're going to have real competition. I also agree with the vice president that this notion that we are ever going to have an ability to simply click through and people are going to be able to be informed enough to make decisions just will not ever come about. One of the things that I've put in my portability and interoperability legislation is a third concept called delegability. So can I delegate the guardianship of my data to a third party? And I think that is a concept that needs a lot more development. I've been following what our European friends have been doing, and it's an area I think of great opportunity. On China, and let me be clear, I think it's, and I put this preface in place because, again, Mr. Trump never puts prefaces in place. You know, my challenge is with the Chinese Communist Party, with President Xi Jinping. It's not with China or the Chinese people. But I am greatly concerned with the Communist Party in China and Xi Jinping and their attempt to utilize their technology platforms, the Alibabas, Badu's, Tencent's, Huawei's, as in effect arms of the state. And we talk about the growth of the Chinese apps like TikTok. Let me take 30 seconds to describe my view of kind of the Chinese economic system and why I think there may be, again, potential alliances amongst, democracies and free market democracies all around the world. Is that my sense, and I see this play out in 5G right now, real time, where for the first time ever, the Chinese are now basically setting the protocols, the standards, the rules and procedures, standards and rules of the road that generally the Americans or Europeans or Japanese have set over the last 50 years. Chinese are now doing that. And the Chinese government has a market where they allow ferocious competition at a domestic level until a national champion emerges. And then that national champion gets virtually 75 to 80% of the Chinese market, which equates into 25 to 35% of the world market. And with that launching pad, then can basically compete that where no Western company, European, Korean, Japanese, American, can compete. If you then have a Chinese champion backed oftentimes, as we see in the case of Huawei with a $100 billion backstop, there's no traditional market-based solution to that. And I do think, and this is a bit, Cecilia, off your question, but I do think it begs a moment where there may be kind of a coalition of the willing amongst, and a coalition of the willing not having an economic alliance as much as it would be a technology alliance. Because I really fear that what we're seeing in 5G will repeat itself in AI, and will repeat itself in quantum computing. I think, again, we've seen incredibly creative tools coming out of new apps coming out of China. And I can tell you, as somebody who's on the vice chair of the Intelligence Committee, I fear these not only from an economic dominance standpoint, but I fear them very much from a national security and privacy standpoint.
Senator, you do have that unique view from your position as the lead Democrat on that committee when it comes to security and intelligence. Vice President Vestager, I would love to get your thoughts on if you agree generally with these concerns. I know that in the EU, the EU released a white paper on foreign investment, and I don't think China was really named specifically. I would love to hear your thoughts on, can you tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about when in this paper when it comes to investments from China? Do you share the same sort of national security concerns and that lens that Senator Warner comes with as well when it comes to investments from China?
Well, just a few words on the background for this initiative, because we have state aid control in Europe. You cannot just hand out subsidies. They are controlled. There are strict rules. Some kind of subsidies are banned. For instance, subsidies to cover operating costs. We consider that in particular very harmful. We have transparency. So competitors would know if a competitor had state aid. Our decisions are public. They can be appealed. And we have this because we really cherish fair competition, that businesses they win the market or the customer because of the quality, the prices, the services, their innovative products. And we really want to protect this fair competition, which is why we also stand up against what we consider unfair competition. And we find that if, for instance, businesses are acquired because another, maybe a state-owned, maybe a state-backed business can acquire a European competitor or integrate someone vertically with subsidies, that is not a fair bit for that business. And also, if you are in the union, if you have a foreign subsidy to cover your operating cost, well, then of course you can produce completely different prices than what you could otherwise produce. And we use a lot of procurement processes. I think it's 80% of just the funds of the European Union, they go through procurement processes to make sure that we get the best possible offer, since taxpayers are financing this. And here, of course, we want businesses to compete for the final bid because of the quality and the prices and their efficiency, not to compete on who has subsidies on their books. And of course not who has foreign subsidies on their books, because that doesn't really play out. So we are suggesting to have a couple of instruments to be able to address this, to say, well, ultimately we should be able to prohibit an acquisition if we see that it is being backed by foreign subsidies, or we should be able to tell a company if assets have been built because of foreign subsidies that you have to share the knowledge, share the infrastructure if that has been built with a foreign subsidy, because we really want fair competition here. And we will not have a subsidy race because that will just make it very, very difficult for businesses who comes with a competitive spirit and do not have access to state coffers to do their best. And I think that is very important. And I think we, to a very large degree, I think we share this value base. I very much concur what Senator Warner is saying. And this is why we have suggested to establish a trade and technology council, because the US and EU, we have so many common interests when it comes to these issues, and we should indeed be aligned in a number of these cases, because we have the same view of the internet. We have the same view when it comes to a number of standards, protocols, needed standards for making our world interoperable. I really hope that we could establish this, because that would give us a much stronger stance in a world that is challenged to a completely different degree as to what it was just 5 years ago.
Senator Warner, what is your response to that? The idea of more collaboration with the EU and Vice President Vestager's idea that she's talked about quite a bit about this tech council and more because of these shared values. Do you think that there is enough cooperation and or combined and aligned interests to do something a little bit more structured?
I strongly support that idea. I've been candidly amazed as I've learned more, particularly from the intelligence standpoint, that we've not done more of this over the last 10 or 15 years. And again, I don't want to sound broken record on China, but I think China has been brilliant at exploiting differences between the EU and the United States and Japan, Korea, in many ways. And again, I very much believe that, for example, Huawei comes with enormous subsidies that gives them an enormous advantage over European companies like Ericsson and Nokia, because if they come with a market dominance in China, where they're able to accrue profits there, they then have government backing that gives them no pricing constraints at all. That to me is enormously unfair competition. And let me be clear, they've used these same market advantages in the United States And one of the interesting things I like to point out is because they've sold into so many of our smaller telcos, if you do an overlay of where Huawei has sold equipment and where the American intercontinental ballistic missile bases are, it's almost a complete match. So in the case of Huawei, there is both a circumstance, I think, of an economic advantage, and I think there's increasing recognition of a security concern that many of the EU nations, at least services, would validate, at least on a private basis. What I would hope that we could talk about, and I know that the EU has suggested this, the British have come forward with a more formal proposal. There's a group of us in the United States that are saying, we need to have this collaboration, and not just with our European partners, but we ought to bring in India and Korea and Japan, and countries like Australia have already been on the kind of the leading edge of pointing out some of these challenges. And I think we've got both the competition issues that the vice president is dealing with, but we also have something, if you believe that what the Communist Party in China is doing in terms of utilizing these technology platforms to create a surveillance state, I believe most of them are indirectly arms of the government. That is a very different model than even the worst case of of Facebook and Google. And my concern is, I think we in the West have been arrogant in presuming that most innovation would originate in the West, even if it didn't originate in the West, that we would set the standards, the rules, the procedures, and the protocols. And I think for 60 years post-Sputnik, the Europeans, the Americans, with the Japanese set that. I think you have in the case of China now, a country with a great country with enormous intellectual capital, with enormous resources, that is saying no, they want to set the standards, the technical standards, and we've seen it play out in 5G, but we're seeing it also real-time play out in artificial intelligence and quantum, in facial recognition, a series of zones. And I'm not reflexively anti-Chinese government on that. I am reflexively, if they're going to set up standards and rules and protocols that are frankly anti-democratic or give so much power to these companies and indirectly the government, I think that poses a threat to kind of what should be our common values-based system. And I know that's a fairly broad answer, but I think it's something that's very much on my mind.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there's a lot to respond to from the vice president. The idea, and I've heard, Senator, you talk before about the idea of even like a Five Eye partner on coming together with some sort of response to Huawei, like some sort of combined response, be it at an actual company or more investment in some of the existing competitors in Europe to Huawei. Vice President, what is your thought, maybe specifically on Huawei and 5G, but also on some of the things that the concerns that the senator outlined?
We've had a very long process. It started basically last summer, where we, with the member state, made an assessment of the risk associated with sort of every part of the 5G value chain, because it is quite a complex ecosystem you have there. And with that risk assessment, we developed a toolbox for member states, because this is the competence of the member state, to deal with these risks. And we are awaiting a report on how that has developed. Because the situation here is slightly more complex than in the US, because there's much more Huawei technology in the grid already. So member states have to consider very carefully how to deal with that, how to make sure that their network is secure. And obviously, this is of crucial importance because 5G will be sort of the backbone of industrial tech. So when we really push the digitization of our societies, the security of the 5G network is absolutely of the essence. I think it's very right what the senator just said, that only now we have woken up to the reality that it will not always be sort of a given that innovation will happen in the West, and standards will be set in the West. And maybe it is quite healthy that we realize that we have to work together and push for the things that we believe in to be maintained and to be developed within sort of our line of values. And I think there's so much encouragement in the fact that sort of our take on universal values when it comes to democracy and the integrity of the individual is so widely shared, because we see that, of course, in different interpretations, but we see it still shared in Japan, in India, in a number of African countries. So there's a lot. Whenever you start looking, you see that both when it comes to security, but also when it comes to ensuring that our digital society is not a surveillance society, but a society that really make the best use of digital technologies. I think that is basically what is at stake in these years. And we have a lot to fight for, and we will have a much better chance of success if we do that together.
Indeed. I'm going to shift back actually to the internet companies, back to digital, from telecom. Another area of agreement between Vice President and the US and the EU is that safe harbors that exist right now for internet companies based on EU law and US law, there seems to be an agreement that they need updating. Can you talk, of course, Vice President, there's consideration of liability and reform to that on the ECommerce Directive. There's a lot of discussion in the US about updating Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So these are all liability protections. What is your view, and I'll start with you, Vice President, about what that looks like? What's the need? where are you seeing the gaps, and why there needs to be potentially some updating?
Well, exactly. This question is a very good illustration of how far we have traveled the last 20 years. Because when the legislation, the e-commerce directive, was made back in the year 2000, what we now see as platforms and gatekeepers was considered, mere channels, intermediaries, but basically channels. And that is so much now in the past, because you see that business models have developed around the content that others provide. But there would be no business model if it weren't for the content, and this has led us to start a public consultation on how to deal with the question exactly of liability and responsibility. And responsibility in particular, both to say, well, if you want to make sure that the rules that we have long discussed, intensively discussed, agree on and enforced in the real world, that you also see that in sort of the digital world. And since the two, they seem to merge more and more, of course, it becomes so much more important. For instance, if a blog post is taken down, that you have your rights to deal with that, to appeal that, to say, well, no, this is my right to free speech. There's nothing here that should be controlled by you, that you can then have it coming back. But also that consumers know that there is a system in place so that they get the same guarantees as they would do if they enter a shop on the high street. Because here it's sort of the obligation to know your merchants, to act against counterfeit, all of that we would like to progress on. Also because we have a system where you don't necessarily have to be registered here, and we would want everyone doing business in Europe also to establish themselves here one way or another. And in that country of origin, that's the enforcement is done there in a way that can be trusted with the country of destination of those digital services. Because the very unfortunate thing we see now is that individual member states, they start acting, and for good reasons. I understand completely where they're coming from, But the result is, of course, a fragmented single market where consumers do not have the same protection, and where platforms will have to deal with different sets of legislation. And we don't want that kind of red tape either. So we have this sense of urgency because the world has changed, you know, can barely recognize it over the last 20 years.
Thank you. And before I go to you, Senator, with that same question, I would like to invite the audience and those who may be following online to submit questions via email at brusselsforum@gmfus.org or on Twitter by using the hashtag Brussels Forum. Senator, please, on the US side, how are you thinking about updates?
Well, let me step back and kind of just give my kind of more macro view here and then drill down on Section 230. I think about when Section 230 was written back in the late 90s. I think we were all enormous techno optimists. We thought, you know, here are these wonderful platforms that are going to democratize the world and the market square of ideas. And I think we went through almost a slightly naive, and I was definitely part of the naive crew that said, you know, technology is going to only bring upside. And I think in the United States, on the political standpoint, you know, through most of the 2000s and even maybe up to 2015, there was this wide-based embrace that, you know, my gosh, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Twitters are you know, the epitome of American innovation, and they should be celebrated. Somehow that all started to kind of come apart. I think in particular, what the spark, and maybe because of my role on the Intelligence Committee, I'm a little more obsessed on this, but was with the Russian intervention into our elections in 2016. And the ability with relatively unsophisticated tools for the Internet Research Agency and others, you know, to create this huge phenomena of fake identities, to manipulate in our free speech, to basically manipulate these platforms in ways that had been unpredicted. I often like to point out that, you know, we saw Russian intervention not only in the 2016 elections, we saw it in the Brexit vote in the UK, we saw it so blatantly in the French presidential elections with Macron. The French actually did a better job than the Brits or the Americans on stopping it. And one of the questions why I believe so much that Russians and others will be back in our elections in 2020 and other elections is because if you added up all the Russians spent in our elections, the Brexit vote, and the French presidential elections, it was less than the cost of one new F-35 airplane. So it is both cheap and effective as a tool. And that kind of brought it, and we then had this problem where, but the platform said, well, we bear no responsibility for content, we bear no responsibility for any right to investigate. Please don't interfere with us. Allow Mark Zuckerberg to make all the determinations of what is truth or not truth on the platform. And the enormous, I think, mistake he's made where he said, you know, I'm not saying the vice president's a politician. I guess I'm a politician. As a politician American, I can lie with impunity on Facebook and have no responsibility. And we've seen this enormous pushback on Section 230, and not just in the political sphere. We see, you know, West African scammers trying to masquerade as American service members. We see sites like Grindr where somebody comes into an enormous harassment campaign against an ex-boyfriend, and Grindr uses the Section 230 as a defense mechanism. We see Facebook in many ways, you know, dismiss any responsibility for the brutal murder of Rohingyas because of the content being put forward in Myanmar. So I think there is a real sense of need to reform. You know, again, I fear that this is an area that, and I say this with respect to the vice president, you know, an America of 20 years ago would have already tried to set the reforms and set the rules. We have not. And consequently, you know, our British friends and our French friends, our Australian friends, you know, I think the Christchurch agenda was, you know, a movement towards reform. And unfortunately, America is not participating in all of these actions. And I think we should be engaged in this. And what is particularly problematic, and I'm sounding, Madam Vice President, I'm not normally this partisan, so I apologize. I'm usually known in Washington as being a pretty bipartisan guy, but I'm pretty frustrated with some of Mr. Trump's activities, and I know how he thinks about you, so I won't ask you what you think about him. But I get very concerned when President Trump says, all right, he wants to take on Section 230, and instructs the Justice Department take action when it appears to be politically self-serving, not really based upon truthfulness of content, or back to the original reason why Section 230 was put in place, in a sense to promote competition. Well, I believe that Section 230 now becomes a bar and a prohibition to new companies coming in, because if the platforms have this invulnerability shield around them, it means their behavior is less robust, and it really is used as a way to, I think, decrease competition and decrease new starts. And it protects their close to monopoly status. And so we ought to look at 230 both in terms of content, but also in terms of competition issues for reform.
Indeed. I just want to remind the audience, you can ask and submit questions at brusselsforum@gmfus.org or at #BrusselsForum on Twitter. We do have one question, but I would like to ask, because it's really remarkable what's happening right now in the US, and I'm very curious, Vice President, what your observations are when it comes to some of the politics that are swirling around. If you care to answer, because it has become quite politicized, big tech and speech, and also the daily changes by the platforms themselves on the speech policy. So that's one area, the daily changes on speech. Then there's sort of the politicalization, of some of the speech policies in the US. From your seat in Brussels, you're watching this and thinking what?
Well, I really don't think that it's for me to comment. But what I have seen is from the very first time when I was in the US, I think we just sort of reopened the first Google case until now. The debate has changed a lot. It's really a different debate, and I think it's across the aisle. I think, of course, the senator is very much a leader and a first mover in this area. But I sense that so many people, lawmakers, attorney generals all over the US, have engaged in a renewed debate about how to make sure that sort of the digital world is also a world of fairness and transparency. And it has been very inspiring to follow that change. And I think it is very important because what we are dealing with here is basically the design of very fundamental democratic values of the future. And in that, of course, the EU and the US should be together. So, I really appreciate the leadership of the senator, but also having followed and being inspired of the changes made, and see that you have people on both sides really engaging in this. And I think that change is a structural change. So, I really look forward to continue working with colleagues in the US on a number of these issues, because this is not about technology. This is about the society that we want to live in, and what role should be the role of the marketplace.
Let me just add one thing to the Vice President's comments, Cecilia. One, she's a much better diplomat than I am. Two, she is absolutely accurate, and I for the audience do want to make clear the issues we've talked about: Section 230, portability, delegability, even the antitrust issues. There is an opportunity in the United States because these are bipartisan issues. My concern with the administration is specific to the administration. These are not breaking down Democrat, Republican in the United States. And I do think as the Vice President said, there is enormous opportunity for enhanced partnership between the United States, the EU, and I think democracies that value individual rights all across the world.
There's a question now from one of the viewers, Michael Nelson at Carnegie Endowment. Both in France and in the US, there are proposals for a for a data tax. Even Andrew Yang, a US presidential candidate, is talking about it. How would that work? Do you think there are serious considerations for such an idea, a data tax? I can start with you, Vice President.
Well, we don't think so much about it as a data tax. We have been working intensively with the question of how to make sure that also companies with a digital business model contribute to their society. And that comes from an observation that, you know, people work so hard, business owners, to do their business, to make a profit, and they pay their taxes. And you know, that is the huge majority of businesses, they do that. And they have to look at digital businesses competing for capital, for skilled people, for customers, not contributing in the same way. And that is simply not fair. So we have had a push for a digital taxation here within the EU, finding a number of proxies for how to deal with this, because it is indeed a different business model. Then with the leadership of the OECD, we very much appreciate that they are now pushing for a global consensus, because obviously these are global issues. It should be dealt with in a global manner. Unfortunately, the US has just withdrawn from these discussions. With a somewhat mixed message. I think there is still a chance that they would want to come on board, but we would still, you know, want to do a push for a global consensus, because it ought to be a global thing. But if that is not possible, our president have asked us then to pick it up again. I don't know what would then be the form of digital taxation, because of course we would assess both sort of what we learned with the first proposal that we made in the EU and then the OECD line of thinking, because they're really, you know, they have the leadership in this, and we from that we could sort of pick it up if it turns out to be impossible to create a global standard. But a global standard would obviously be the best.
And Senator, am I mistaken that you've advocated for people understanding the value, but not necessarily a tax? Correct my thinking if that's wrong. What is your thoughts on that?
I think you start with the value. You start with market mechanisms like portability, interoperability. I've not weighed in on a digital tax, and I have, you know, I have concerns whether there are country by country digital tax schemes. I'm concerned as well about certain efforts towards data localization that sometimes, you know, at least superficially appear to me to be, you know, efforts kind of aimed at American companies disproportionately. But I think this issue, Cecilia, has not, there's not the kind of traditional circling where we have to protect our American companies from this, you know, French or other country, you know, taxation schemes, because quite honestly, the digital platforms, I don't think pay their fair basis of tax even in the United States. If they were paying an enormous, you know, share in the United States relative to their values, there might be more willingness to fend off our European friends or others about taxation. I clearly think these platform companies have been able to take full advantage of picking seams in our domestic and international taxation systems in a way that they're probably the best in the world at moving around intellectual property and manipulating the tax schemes. So if there was a global framework that was rational and not disproportionately unfair to American companies, I'd take a look at it. But this is an area that, frankly, I know that Mr. Yang has weighed in, but I'm not at a knowledge level high enough to sound competent at all.
Perfect. I think we have time for one last question. This is from Olga Rujansky. How will COVID-19 pandemic data be influencing future trends in transatlantic digital policy, and whether this would interfere with a citizen's right to privacy? So the data that's being collected. Senator, you can start, please.
Well, this is a hugely important question. I have legislation that would put in place appropriate privacy protections. I mentioned the Apple Google platform earlier on contact tracing. My major concern is secondary use and what happens with this information. I'm very concerned. For example, we have elections in the fall in the United States, as I think most people know. If the administration was suddenly to use this data as a way to try to prevent people from voting because of extra constraints under the guise of COVID concerns. So we have not sorted this out. And so much of what stopped privacy legislation happening in the United States has been an important issue, but not, I think, the issue that should be stopping legislation. That is around private right of action, and that needs to be resolved. But I am afraid that we're entering into this sphere of a massive data collection around COVID, necessary, but we've not put any guard rules in place. So I think the questioner's concerns are really valid.
Vice President?
Well, I think this is very important, because with COVID and the use of technology to fight the pandemic, some sort of pretended that there was a choice between health and privacy, and we have resisted that, to say, well, no, there's no choice here, because if you cannot provide people with privacy, how would they ever trust technology to serve them? And people need to trust the technology in order to use it. And this is why we have, really pushed for solutions when it comes, for instance, to virus tracing or tracking that are decentralized, or at least where you can make sure that it's not built on your localization. There's no data gathering as such, that you can trust that these are my data, they are on my gadget, I know what is going on here, and that you have transparency. Because if you do that, well, then you can actually see that when we are put to a test, because of course it is a test. This pandemic is awful. It's costing people's lives. It's challenging us all. So we really put to a test, what will we cherish? What will we do in order to make technology help us here? That we say, well, we can actually do both. We can protect the individual, the integrity of the individual, your dignity, while at the same time developing technology that will help us fight this pandemic. And that is indeed doable. It can be decentralized. It can work with Bluetooth. It can have the standards that allows for interoperability, so that you can use it cross-border. And that, I think, is very, very important. And that could be a lesson that we can take further on, that we can build a different trust in the technology that will allow many more people to see that a society where we make the best use of digital technology is a society where we can fulfill promises that may have been unkept, of real access to healthcare, of access to education of high quality, of living in clean cities where you can, fully breathe and you have clean water, all of that. But the fundamental is trust. And I think this is where we start building it, by showing that when we really test it, well, we stand by our values.
Well, I would just like to say, I wish we had another hour. I'm sure we could go. This sort of forum is really fantastic to have, this transatlantic conversation. First, I'd like to thank the German Marshall Fund's Brussels Forum for hosting this, Vice President Margrethe Vestager and Senator Mark Warner for taking time out of your very busy schedules for joining us. And thank you for all the people who came in to view.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.